Welcome to the Americas 360 podcast. Get the inside scoop and the outside perspective on the latest developments from Canada, Latin America, and everywhere in between. Americas 360 is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Americas 360. I'm your host, John Molesky. This program is brought to you by the world's #1 think tank for regional studies, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And Americas 360 is a collaboration among the center's Argentina Project, Brazil Institute, Canada Institute, Latin American Program, and Mexico Institute. Well, the United States will host the 9th Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles from June 6th to June 10th. With the advertised theme of building a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for the Western Hemisphere. Well, much has changed across the hemisphere since the last in-person summit in Lima, Peru in 2018, and for some leaders, the summit will be their first face-to-face meeting with many of their counterparts. Whenever world leaders gather anywhere for anything, expectations emerge, so we're wondering, what should we expect at the summit, and what's been noteworthy in the lead-up to the summit? Here to discuss those questions and more are Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow Cindy Arnson.
Hi, John.
Hey, Cindy. Brazil Institute Fellow Daniela Campello.
Hi, John.
Hi, Danny. Mexico Institute Director Andrew Rudman.
John.
Hey, Andrew. And Canada Institute Director Christopher Sands.
Hello, bonjour, John.
Chris, great to see you. And we have a special guest today. He's Dr. Richard Feinberg. Richard is a global fellow and an advisory board member of the Wilson Center's Latin American program. And Richard was a principal architect of the first Summit of the Americas held in Miami back in 1994. Dr. Feinberg, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you all.
So, Richard, I want to come back to you in a moment and ask about then and now. But first, there has been breaking news in the lead up to the summit, all kinds of conniptions about who's going to come and who's not going to come. A couple days ago, it was AMLO setting terms for his involvement. Could you tell us about those developments?
Sure, John. I had a feeling you'd come to me. President López Obrador, as you say, a couple days ago, indicated that if Colombia, Venezuela, and Nicaragua were not invited to the summit, that he would not attend. I think it's really, first of all, I would say that I think when, we've talked about this before, when López Obrador is talking foreign policy, he is almost always aiming at a domestic constituency. This is a man who is truly a believer that the best foreign policy is good domestic policy. I think it's also important to underscore that he did not say that Mexico wouldn't participate. He won't go, but his foreign minister will go. And I think that's an indication that while he may be trying to make a political statement in terms of who should be invited, he knows that Mexico can't not be there. So I think there's sort of a positive element of that. I think having just had a virtual bilat with President Biden on April 29th, I think it is, to be charitable, unfortunate that he chose to make this announcement in a press conference instead of conveying it directly to the White House. I don't think it'll have long-term repercussions on the overall relationship, but I do think certainly for those, particularly those who are staunch defenders of our current Cuba policy and are concerned about Venezuela and Nicaragua, it does call into question, I think to some extent it limits the maneuverability of the Biden administration to work with López Obrador, because those who are strong proponents of a hard line on Cuba will accuse the Biden administration of collaborating with someone who clearly doesn't share that view. So I think problematic, but not ultimately destructive.
Well, your observation about playing to a domestic audience would probably explain why he chose the press conference route versus the discreet call to the White House. Richard, I'm going to come back to you. There are others, and Danny, I'm going to ask you about Bolsonaro's decision to participate or not in a moment. But first, Richard, if I could circle back to you, and we introduce you as being part of the initial Summit of the Americas, and now here we are in 2022 trying to do it again. Could you give us a brief history lesson on the summit and the initial conception, and then where it's headed today?
So, to be fair to the Biden administration, we had an international and regional environment that was much more conducive. the countries were recently transiting from authoritarianism to liberal democracy. The economies were opening up. We had just signed the NAFTA agreement that had passed through the Congress. The other Latin American countries came to us and said, we want free trade. And so there was both in the economic and political areas more of a convergence of values and goals. That's less true today. Okay. On the other hand, I'm astounded at what looks like a lack of adequate diplomacy. We spent a lot of time making sure that both the Mexicans and the Brazilians were on board. We sent a number of high-level delegations. We asked them what they wanted to have on the agenda. And so the idea that, a month beforehand, we would suddenly be hearing that they're not interested, it just could not have happened. So I do think we have to look at the Biden's administration diplomatic failures here. Now, having said that, I do think probably what most of the countries are looking for is just to pressure the U.S. into making it an agenda a little more substantive and more aligned with their interests. Now, here's where the Biden administration has gotten itself into a pickle. It's allowed its foreign policy to be clipped by one interest here, one interest there. It can't engage with Cuba because of the Cuban exile community in South Florida. It can't talk about trade because of elements of the AFL-CIO and certain grassroots groups. So when you eliminate all of these possible foreign policy initiatives, and then the Latins say, well, why show up in Los Angeles? Because the administration is largely empty-handed. So finally, the administration is seeing some of the foreign policy costs of its pandering to certain domestic interests, both economic and interest group interests. So I think that's where we are. And now the administration's in a tough spot. Is it going to confront a couple of those domestic interests and say, listen, we have to have a success here at the summit, and we're just going to have to give the Latin Americans some of the things that they want? Or hang tough, in which case the potential of a serious diplomatic embarrassment is at the door of the administration.
So when you would talk about a theme like building sustainable, resilient, equitable future, these are so generic sounding. So it doesn't speak to what you're talking about, the actual agenda and what countries want to talk about.
Yeah. Well, so of course the administration has made these, that's not enough. People, this is 30 years into the post-Cold War period. People are used to, they've signed hundreds of documents saying all these nice things. They want to see some meat on the bones. So what would that mean? If you're going to talk about international health initiative, sure. So far, the administration has not done nearly enough on vaccine distribution in the Western Hemisphere, leaving a vacuum that was filled by the Chinese and others. Even if their vaccines aren't as good as ours, still they were there. Ours were much less there. So something we got to put some numbers on it. What are we going to do in the health area in Latin America? Similarly, if we're going to talk about renewables in the energy area, fine. We need to put together a serious package. All the Latin Americans are seeing that overnight we could come up with 30 to 40 billion for the Ukraine. 40 million people. Latin America, 650 million. We talk in terms of few hundred million here and there. We can't even seem to get that out there. Then, if you're going to talk about global supply chains, okay, what about them? Yeah, the market will drive some of them to the Western Hemisphere, leaving Asia and Eastern Europe. But is the administration going to try to accelerate that process? Now, that's not that difficult to put some meat on that bones. You could say the Development Finance Corporation, the World Bank, the IDB, the Exim Bank could help build the necessary infrastructure. We could set up educational partnerships to train the labor force. We could work with the SMEs through various mechanisms as well. So we could put some meat on the bones. But so far, I think the administration is afraid to talk about anything that some people will say, you're just doing more offshoring. You're costing jobs rather than creating jobs in the United States. And so let's see if the administration has the nerve to explain something that is not that easy to explain and push back on some of those criticisms. So that's really it's a political decision that has to be made at the highest levels in the White House. Are they going to make this a success with some meat on the bones on these different initiatives in Los Angeles? And if not, they're just going to take a diplomatic humiliation and maintain their domestic political positions.
The discrepancy you point out between the focus on Ukraine versus the lack of focus on the hemisphere, it really It's somewhat stunning to see nations behave like individuals and the inability to walk and chew gum at the same time. But that seems to be a thing that is not uncommon. Danny, we've queued up a few times the role of Brazil, and Richard mentioned the lack of coordination with Brazil, the diplomatic coordination. What is the latest on Bolsonaro's potential non-participation?
Thanks, John. We started, there was a discussion about Bolsonaro trying to meet with Biden and finding this as a very first opportunity to be together with them. But more recent news are that Bolsonaro has been thinking twice whether to come or not. So it seems that there's something, the people who are closer to him tend to think he shouldn't come. And then there's the Itamaraty, our diplomats, trying to push him towards coming. And I think that when you asked me what does Brazil expect from the meeting? I'm not sure what Bolsonaro expects, but I know what he doesn't want to talk about. So he doesn't want to talk about the Amazon, which has just hit another record of deforestation. He doesn't want to talk about the elections that he has been questioning over and over again. And he's very afraid of having to talk about openly to support the elections, to support the electoral results in 2022. So I think these are the two topics he doesn't want to talk about. And if he feels he's going to be exposed into talking about these two topics, that's probably going to be the reason for him not to come.
Mm-hmm. Chris, Canada has generally been a good partner for the U.S. and supportive of these endeavors. What about in this case? What everyone's describing so far is a potential disaster, may be hyperbole, but certainly not the kind of success that the Biden administration would hope for.
Well, I would say the Canadians, John, look at these things in almost two tracks. On the one hand, there's the Latin American agenda, the Western Hemisphere agenda, on which they know they're marginal, but they do have views on democracy, views on development, views on migration, which they would like to expose at a summit like this. And they see an opportunity to talk to some of their partners other than the United States. The other track for Canada is it's a summit. And Canada is in so many different clubs that the U.S. is in, from the G7 to the G20 to NATO, and they're only less than 2 hours flight from Ottawa to Washington. So they have a tendency to take the long view, and they'll have a series of policy priorities that are in the main bilateral. They might affect the U.S. policy on Ukraine or other things, and they will just every opportunity continue to make those cases. So for the Canadians, they'll win because they'll get to make their case again to more officials, while at the same time maybe managing things on the Latin American side. And I think that's given them much more interest in participating and much more willingness to play a role here.
Cindy, I was going to ask you a specific question, but you know what? You've heard enough now that I'll just let you take it where you want to take it.
I think despite all the political difficulties that the Biden administration has had getting to the summit, the most important thing will be to show up with something concrete to offer, whether it is a package that includes the U.S. Development Finance Corporation with the IDB and the World Bank, as Richard has indicated, a large package of loan guarantees to encourage U.S. investment, to bring nearshoring to the area of Latin America that's closest to the United States, which would be the broad Caribbean basin, not only the Caribbean and Central America and Mexico, but also Colombia and northern South America. Unless there is a concrete offer, I think it's not going to be successful. There was a high-level democracy summit that was held late last year. A lot of articulation of core principles of support for democracy, but there is even in the Biden administration a recognition that democracies have to deliver things that people want. And unless the United States is able to partner in concrete ways with the health sector, with U.S. medical schools, partnering with medical schools in the region, something that is a really bold initiative. And at the same time, as much as there is criticism of the Biden administration for being late and for the lack of coherent messaging around the summit, I think there is also a degree of responsibility of the region itself. I have never seen Latin America and the Caribbean more fragmented politically, more incapable of articulating a common vision of how it wants to relate to the United States and the rest of the world, Canada, even outside the hemisphere. So I think that it's a very challenging environment that the Biden administration is facing, but it is critical to show up with a concrete offer.
Andrew Rudman, based on everything we've talked about and the potential for this unraveling with multiple heads of state not attending, any chance AMLO gets his way and the countries that he once invited, that the U.S. could actually back down?
That's a great question, John. It's one I think I would have also posed. I'll throw out a thought, and I'm sure my colleagues have other thoughts. It strikes me that AMLO, having sort of drawn the line in the sand, it almost makes it impossible for the Biden administration to invite Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, because it would look very much like the Biden administration was allowing the Mexicans to make that decision. And in addition, and maybe Richard or Cindy can talk to the fact that the U.S. doesn't recognize Maduro as the leader of Venezuela. So I'm not even sure technically if we quote unquote could invite Venezuela if we wanted to. But others know more about that than I do.
Well, let me say so I think these are three different cases, right? On Venezuela, we already have the Guaido sort of semi-solution. Nobody in the hemisphere supports Ortega, so he could be left out. Nobody would care. So the issue really only is Cuba. Now here it's a self-inflicted wound, and this has to do, if Biden had followed what he had said he would do during his campaign and go back to the Obama policies of trying to work with Cuba, they wouldn't be in this pickle right now. The Cubans did attend two summits in the last two in Lima and in Panama. And I can tell you, I was there, and they did not behave as spoilers. They did not try to wreck the proceedings. They behaved as a responsible state actor. Yeah, but right now, can they go back? I don't know. It would be difficult, and Menendez and Rubio and all these people would. Now, let me suggest there are two pieces of the summit. One is, as a number of us have emphasized, there has to be meat on the bones. There has to be something of value substantively in the different key areas. But there's also the matter of massaging leadership and giving them a sense of place. And that's where it's difficult with Bolsonaro because, the Democratic Party doesn't like him. Of course, they see him as sort of a Trumpite. But, you've got to at least be polite. We have to figure some way to engage with him without an excessively warm embrace. With AMLO, AMLO, he has to be the center of attention. He doesn't like multilateral events because he's not at the center of attention. I mean, this transcends this particular summit. So you have to give him something which makes him, which feeds his narcissism. Now, I've been thinking, why not let him have a big demonstration in the Hollywood Bowl with 50,000 screaming Mexican Americans, AMLO, AMLO, AMLO. He would love that. So you got to give him something that appeals to his sense of persona. So those are the two things. Give these guys a sense of persona, which we don't seem to have put in place, as far as I can tell. And then there has to be meat on the bones on specific initiatives.
Actually, I have a few questions to Professor Feinberg. In the case of Bolsonaro, the meat and the bones, the concern that I have is that these two topics are topics that address the very goals of the conference, right? Environment, sustainability, and democracy. So how to give him something which is not strengthening him in an agenda that goes exactly against those two goals. And the other question is, what is the downside of inviting everyone? Because this is one question that why not invite everyone and talk about democracy and talk about prospects? Is this something that shouldn't be done in your view? That there's a point in only inviting democracies? This is not the summit for democracy, right?
Okay, so this goes to a broader issue. Originally, and I can take some credit for this because when Al Gore announced the Summit of the Americas in '94, actually in Mexico, on the plane on the way down, it said, and President Clinton wants to invite all the leaders of the Western Hemisphere. And I said, Mr. Vice President, don't you think we should insert all the democratically elected leaders in the Western Hemisphere? And that's how that adjective was inserted. Now, I have to tell you, I wasn't thinking of Cuba because in those years, there was no way you were going to invite Fidel Castro to any meeting because the media, everything, he would just be the total center of attention. So that nobody even just thought of that. I was actually thinking of Fujimori, actually in Peru. It was a shot across the bow warning him that if he stepped beyond certain red lines, he would be disinvited. So that's actually the origins. But as the Canadians would remember, finally in Quebec in 2001, there it was enshrined that the Summit of the Americas was about democracies. Now, that then was modified when all the Latins demanded that Cuba be inserted into the Panama process. And they said they wouldn't attend, even though it was in Panama. So that was the gauntlet was thrown down to the Obama administration, and the Obama administration decided, all right, we'd rather have Cuba inside the tent, and we want to have the summits continue because they're important to U.S. foreign policy. So we bowed to that pressure. Now, that was in the context of Obama completely turning around U.S. foreign policy toward Cuba to try a policy more of détente or openness. The problem that Biden now faces is that he has a very hostile relation with Havana. So it's not a, remember, Obama had this glorious handshake with Raul Castro. Biden can't do that. So Biden's trapped by his own, domestic political opportunism.
Cindy, if I'm reading my cues right, I think you wanted to say something.
By deciding to host the summit for only the second time since 1994, the U.S. government had to pay attention to principles of democracy and also to domestic politics. It makes sense that Maduro of Venezuela and the Cuban government, the Nicaraguan government are not invited, given what is going on right now in the bilateral relationship. And I would say, Nicolas Maduro is being investigated under indictment, has had his visa pulled from traveling to the United States, is being investigated for involvement in organized crime, for involvement in crimes against humanity. It makes no sense, on the one hand, to have a summit of democracy and on the other hand, invite a figure like that to the United States. The same with Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. He threw all of the opposition candidates into jail in advance of the presidential elections last November. How are you going to, with a straight face, invite a figure like Ortega? But there is a strong domestic politics aspect of this. You also can't invite Cuba, which has been identified by the Trump administration as a state sponsor of terrorism. The Biden administration has not revoked that designation, has not revived the Obama policy, and so there are real constraints about holding this meeting in the U.S.
Well, there have been no shortage of criticisms leading up to the summit as far as the planning, and this panel has certainly echoed that today. And I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish, but in the limited time we have remaining, I want to ask each of you for sort of a best-case scenario. As far as expectations, are there reasonable expectations for tangible outcomes that would be seen as a successful outcome? And I'll give each of you a quick chance to respond to that, maybe about 30 seconds each with time remaining. Chris Sands, can we start with you?
Sure, John, and thanks very much. I think that knowing we have low expectations going into the summit, I think I'm going to advocate we take a Canadian perspective, which is this is one more conversation in a movable feast. We'll see some good connections, but then nothing will be necessarily final in this particular summit. And maybe countries like Canada can move the ball forward on things like democracy, on other issues, and the consensus will broaden a little bit. That will be picked up, whether it's at the G20 or at one of the future summits coming up. It may not be possible for this to be the summit of all summits, but there will be more summits, and maybe we can get some momentum out of this one rather than giving up on it entirely.
So lowering expectations a bit. Andrew Rudman?
Sure, John. One thing that I think maybe there is somewhat more convergence is on the topic of migration and the recognition that it's a hemispheric issue that requires hemispheric attention, right? This is no longer a U.S. Mexico or U.S. Central America issue. So If we want to try to be optimistic, maybe there is some, at least, picking up on what Chris said, at least some acknowledgement that the countries in the hemisphere have to address the movement of people collectively. The other place, maybe there could be some collaboration. I'd certainly like to see it is more focus on learning the lessons of the pandemic, particularly on the health side, in strengthening health systems and being better prepared for the future. Those are both probably maybe in the line of lowering expectations. I'm probably being really optimistic, but that's what I would hope for.
Cindy Arntzen.
I think the best way for the Biden administration and Latin America in general to salvage the summit is for the United States to offer concrete things to those who have showed up. And people who have boycotted or have decided for one reason or another not to come might get left out of some of those benefits. But there are a lot of countries that will be there and will be there at a senior political and economic level, even if they don't send the president. But the way to rescue it and avoid embarrassment, frankly, is to show that the United States has something concrete to offer to the countries of the Western Hemisphere as they try to recover from the pandemic and now face this trifecta of new difficulties from rising inflation, rising food prices, rising energy prices. We have to be able to respond to the concrete needs of the countries of our hemisphere.
Thanks. Danny Campeo.
My best case scenario would be that the summit brings a view of where Latin America is going after these periods of crisis, very deep crisis in which the countries are. My less optimistic view, which is somehow optimistic, is that the fact that AMLO eventually does not give too much leverage to Bolsonaro to go back to Brazil and say, after all I've done in the environment and on democracy, I'm still there in the international arena and talking to Biden, and nobody cares.
Richard, our special gift to our special guest is to give you the final word.
Thanks. So I think a lot of very good points have already been made. Yes, I think we can still have a successful summit. I think some of these threats to not attend may be useful from the point of view of, I know people working very hard in the bureaucracy on Latin America who have been struggling to get the attention of the senior level officials. They can use these threats from the countries in the region to get their attention and warn them that they've got to put more meat on the bones on these various initiatives we've been talking about, supply chains, global health and pandemics, energy sustainability, migration. There are things that we can do. We know there are things that can be done. We know that where there are resources that multilateral and bilateral and private sector that can be put behind these initiatives. They got to be properly packaged correctly. The key leaders have to be given their moment in the sun, and so some of the supporters of Lula may not be happy if Bolsonaro, is given his due, but that's international diplomacy, and then there has to be a tremendous improvement in messaging. They haven't gotten the invitations out, you realize, 3 weeks before. Nobody seems to understand why. We haven't gotten enough ambassadors appointed. Well, we know part of the reason, but I think it suggests that Blinken has to make a few phone calls, and he has to tell the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I need this. I needed the $30 billion for the Ukraine, but I need this now, tomorrow. So there has to be, some phone calls made at the very senior levels and a dramatic improvement in messaging.
Going to have a hard time getting that turnout at the Holiday Bowl for AMLO if they don't get those invitations out. Thanks, everybody. Really, Cindy, Danny, Chris, Andrew, and special thanks to you, Richard, for joining us today. This episode of America's 360 was produced by Oscar Cruz, Cecily Fasanella, and Zoe Reed, with the assistance of Christina Sadasegovia and Anita Kirschenbaum. As always, thanks to all of you for your great work behind the scenes to make us sound good on the microphone. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion and that you'll choose to join us again soon for our next episode. Until then, for America's 360 and the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.
You have been listening to America's 360, a podcast about the innumerable ties among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. You can subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. To learn more about our programs, please visit wilsoncenter.org. And please join us again next time for another episode of America's 360.